Times and Sunday Times, Cindy Yu, and Global Affairs correspondent at the Eye, Molly Blackwell. Cindy, Molly, morning to you.
Hello.
Thanks for coming in. Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Let's get started with this on the front of the Times on lots of papers this morning, or at least inside them.
Well, certainly the second edition.
Yes.
It came in quite late, didn't it?
I think there was a lot of frantic rewriting last night.
Yeah, get those pictures on the front page. So we'll start with the Times. Pictures released, documents released, but perhaps not all the documents that MAGA would want.
Yes, definitely not all of them. We're told there's still hundreds of thousands more to come, but actually there was a lot already that came out last night. So journalists are now trawling through that. We have this incredible photo of Andrew lying across the laps of 5 women with Ghislaine Maxwell looking on from behind.
And we should, I'll say early on, we should say that anyone featured in photos, there's no suggestion of wrongdoing, and Andrew himself, as we know, has vigorously denied any.
Exactly, and Andrew is far from the only man, you know, in these photos. Bill Clinton is also in there, Mick Jagger, Michael Jackson, as well as Bill Gates. You know, the movers and shakers basically of America and the UK. Seem to have basically known Epstein on quite an informal level.
Yeah, and inevitably there's going to be a focus on celebrities because there are so many familiar faces in some of the photographs that have been released. But how much are we actually learning that will help the victims and survivors of Epstein, do you think, from what we've seen so far?
Well, I think it's a combination of the way this has been released and what's actually in it. There's this huge tranche of documents just sort of dropped, you know, thousands of them coming out late last night. It will take a while before anyone's actually able to piece together some form of narrative really and what these are actually showing, but also very heavily redacted. I mean, you can see Andrew here, you can see Ghislaine Maxwell, but everything else is redacted within it, and that's the theme all the way through.
Yeah, and the reason for that, they will say, is to protect the identities of victims, but some are saying that the redactions go beyond that perhaps it's a bit too heavy-handed.
Yeah, the Democrats have already come out and said that this is, you know, a sort of a very heavy redaction, and this is only a fraction of what's to come. As you say, they will say this is to protect the identities of survivors, which makes perfect sense. But I think there is a bit of a conflict over whether or not this is really the full picture. You know, the White House says this is the most transparent administration within history, but I think it is a bit hard to tell what really is going on here when so much of not only the imagery but also the wording of this is redacted. Certainly, it's a huge headache for the Trump administration. Trump made releasing the Epstein files and coming clean on that a big part of his pitch for the presidency, and it does seem to be a very important issue for the MAGA base, and it will be interesting to see whether they feel satisfied with what's been released to kind of quell this. Trump has obviously been trying to distance himself from it and trying to, you know, turn away from the headlines on this. Not that there's any accusation that he's done anything wrong, but of course there was a historic friendship there. So it's a really tricky political issue for him, and he's also suffered from within his own ranks politically. You know, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was a loyal ally of his, has really turned on him recently, and that does seem to be in part from the release over the release of the Epstein files. So it does feel like the story which isn't going away either for Andrew or for Trump.
And Cindy, look, sort of as a final thought about all of this, because we have been talking about it quite a lot, and we've been building up to this moment, haven't we, for weeks, knowing that this was going to come. Have we moved any further on in terms of like our understanding of what was going on in the relationships that Jeffrey Epstein had with all these famous people, and the fact that Trump's name doesn't feature, the fact that he doesn't feature in any photographs, the fact his name isn't searchable in this tranche of documents, it doesn't help him kind of put it to bed, does it? Because the question still remains, why is his name not in there, considering that we know that his name does exist in there somewhere?
It really doesn't answer the questions. And for Trump's side, you know, there is a political game here where he's saying, well, look at Bill Clinton, everyone go look at Bill Clinton, you know.
Democrats say it's been front-loaded with Democrats,
right,
particularly
exactly.
Bill Clinton.
So, and this has been a tough week for the MAGA administration. You know, the Susie Wiles, chief of staff, interview out in Vanity Fair this week, describing her boss as having a personality of an alcoholic. It's not an ideal way, I think, for that employer-employee relationship this week. And so I think, but Trump has limited options here. You know, given the passing of the Epstein Files Transparency Act by Congress with that massive majority, that they need to satisfy certain deadlines here. They can't just keep dragging their feet. And the more they do, the more questions are raised. So he has to release more of these files. But I think, you know, as we know from these pictures, there are no suggestions of wrongdoing. So arguably transparency is not a wrong thing if you're not afraid of anything. So that's the inevitable question that is being raised. But I think going back to the British side of things, when these pictures have coming out, you can see why the royal family took the measures that they did on Andrew, because they presumably knew something like this was coming out very, very soon. And had they not done that and this had come out now, you know, the problem for the royal family would be much, much worse.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary photograph. There's another one, I think, of them on a shooting trip at Balmoral as well, which is just extraordinary.
Straightforward shooting weekend.
Yes, what did he called it? Something like that.
Straightforward shooting weekend.
Newsnight, that's right.
Something we can all relate to.
As you say, this is going to be picked over for days because the first tranche, and it's not even complete, is hundreds of thousands of documents.
Are they
so we
the
may
next
well
lot
get...
are going to come? Or we just have
Over the
to...
coming weeks, I believe, but...
Okay.
But this is the feet dragging that is, you know,
Yeah. All right.
Let's move on then to other issues. And the front page of the Financial Times focuses on the agreement made between EU leaders the night before last in Brussels to loan Ukraine money, not to unfreeze Russian assets, but to find another means of supplying them with the cash to keep fighting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you pull out a really important point here. Ukraine will say, you know, obviously this is great news. 90 billion is a large sum of money. In military terms, it doesn't go as far, you know, as you might think, certainly. But it's an attempt to kind of break a deadlock over spending towards Ukraine. I mean, the EU and the UK have given huge sums of financial and military aid to Ukraine, and this is the latest of that. And I do think the timing is interesting. We're obviously seeing the peace talks stall, really. There's a lot of hope that there might be some sort of agreement over the coming weeks, but as yet, Putin's still not agreeing to anything. And I would expect that this is the EU's way of trying to put more cards in Ukraine's hand and saying to Putin, you know, we will keep them in the fight. So really, you should come to the table. But you touched on the frozen Russian assets, and that's a really important part of this. We're talking about 90 billion loan here, but the EU has in its possession 210 billion euros in frozen Russian assets, most of that located in Belgium. The UK has another 25 billion, and there's been this stalemate over whether or not it can be spent. So far they've used the interest of the assets, effectively what those assets have accrued. They have spent that money to support Ukraine, but they haven't touched the actual value of the assets themselves. There's a lot of legal concerns about how that might reshape our own legal system, also whether there would be legal challenges from Russia, which Belgium is really worried about. My understanding is that the UK is really keen to spend this and is keen to push in this direction. But when you look at what the UK has versus the EU, it really has to be a collective response. And at the moment, Belgium seems to be putting its foot down and saying, we're just not going there.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because all this talk about 210 billion being used to draw down that loan from the seized assets. The UK's got about 25 billion, I think, and it's now been announced that they're not going to go for the Russian assets as well because they want to make sure they're working in concert with the EU, with Canada, and with Australia in getting that cash. I mean, the bottom line from this is that Ukraine is getting its money for now, right?
Well, I mean, the 90 billion loan, as Molly says, you know, it is a large sum of money, but not quite enough in some terms of military terms. So it's further stalemate, really, is what this is. And given the situation with Trump's negotiation, quote-unquote negotiation, I think it seems like, because it doesn't actually seem like he's negotiating in Ukraine's favour. He's actually negotiating to end the war on whatever terms that Putin would like, basically. So it's great that Ukraine can keep fighting for now on its own terms, but at the same time, it just doesn't really signal an end to the war anytime soon.
And it seems that Putin's red lines haven't shifted. He did his big 5-hour, was it? Press conference yesterday, fielding questions where he said, oh, yeah, we're ready to talk, we're ready to do a deal, and then pretty much laid out the same bottom lines he's always had, which Ukraine wouldn't find acceptable.
No.
And sadly, you know, he doesn't seem to have much incentive. You know, they are holding up, there's been a kind of stalemate on the battlefield, but Russia is still making these incremental advances, and Putin doesn't seem to care about the huge number of Russian casualties, over 1 million now. So I think from his perspective, why would he stop?
Yeah. Let's move on to The Guardian next, shall we? And Cindy, kind of focus on the UK and some of the problems for number 10, not least this issue of young people finding it difficult to get jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know from other reporting that graduates have been finding it really, really hard to get jobs recently, not least because of AI, but also just because of businesses not doing nearly as well in recent years as before. Now, the Labour Party had previously pledged to end what they call discriminatory lower minimum wages for younger workers. That's between 16 and 24, excuse me. But now, Alan Milburn, who is the former health secretary, is putting his backing behind actually keeping that minimum wage low in order to stimulate that youth jobs.
So that more people hire because they feel they're putting price
Exactly.
down.
So this is another workers' right debate within the Labour Party, having come after the other workers' rights got watered down by the government, and it goes for the fundamental tension between all of this. Do you want to protect workers' rights, or do you want to actually make sure that they get jobs to have in the first place? And where do businesses sit in all of this? And for young people in particular, the point that Alan Milburn is making is that you risk having a lost generation if they leave school, leave university without any jobs at all, because then that actually sets them up quite badly for the future.
It does. It's interesting that workers' rights is being discussed in front of the Guardian. It's also in the Times as well, where they've got reporting about Labour Together, talking about essentially gutting the workers' rights bill. They frame it as sort of an attack on Angela Rayner's legacy, but it also is suggestive of this idea that there are parts of the Labour Party that are trying to find another way through this and save some money.
Yeah, it's a tension between the workers' rights part of the party and then also the economic growth part of the party. How do you have both?
I think the unions would argue that, if you pay people better, there is then more money coming into the economy, which stimulates spending. So I think they would argue it kickstarts a cycle, but of course it means more short-term pain, effectively, for long-term gain, and currently it doesn't seem like the Chancellor feels she has that wiggle room.
We've only got 60 seconds. A bit more pain, long-term gain on the front of the eye.
Yes, not what anybody wants to be reading a few days before Christmas, but it's Reeves in an interview with my colleague Vicky Spratt saying that she can't rule out any future tax hikes. She says the situation is simply too volatile to be able to commit to future budgets. It's obviously after a big tax hike already, and I think it's not what people are going to be comforted by at the moment.
No, she did say they were less necessary, didn't she? And maybe she feels a bit burned from having promised in her first budget there wouldn't be any more, to then introduce 26 billion in November's budget, I guess.
Yeah.
A bit of space in case she does have to do it. I told you I might have to.
Exactly. A bit too late.
A little bit. All right, Cindy, Molly, thanks both for that. We'll see you again in the next hour.
Thanks for now.
All right, and we'll see you again very soon as well. We'll have more coverage of the release of all those Epstein files, but not as much as Maggie would like.
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist